I have kept this log for 31 years. I have written citations in it, and reprimands, and the names of the dead. I have never before written an entry because of a woman with a mallet, but the record should be accurate. That is, in the end, what a log is for. My name is Chev Tural. I hold the rank of Commodore in the Vareth Expeditionary Fleet, and I am the commanding officer of Station Oreth Vel, occupies the trailing Lagrange point of the fourth planet of a system I will not name here for operational reasons. The station is large. Earth's 11 capital ships in its outer ring, runs 4 active repair cradles at any given time, and employs at last count 4,211 personnel, military-civilian contract, and what we call the floor staff, is everyone the roster does not otherwise know how to classify. Riva Dawn was floor staff. She had been floor staff for 6 years by the time the incident I am recording took place. Her assignment was Cradle 7, which is the station's primary launch bay for capital-class vessels. The biggest space on the station, a cathedral of a room if you believe in cathedrals, which I do not though, I am told the comparison is apt. The cradle is 400 meters from the blast-rated blast doors to the rear maintenance apron, and its ceiling rises 60 meters at the crown. It smells of propellant and hot plating, and the particular mineral sharpness of Vareth-grade coupling grease, which is a smell I associate with competence, though I did not always. Riva Dawn's official duties in Cradle 7 were sweep the apron, clear tool debris between maintenance rotations, maintain the fluid catch trays under the launch rail assembly, form first-line checks on the bay's atmospheric seal indicators. She was paid at the floor staff rate, which is not a rate I am proud of. She wore the gray coveralls that floor staffs wear, with the orange shoulder tab that means non-technical, and she carried a long-handled push broom and a utility apron with pouches for a rag, a stylus, and a handheld seal checker the size of a thick book. I did not know her name before the incident. I want to be honest about that. I knew the names of the engineers. There were, at the time the incident began, 104 Vareth-certified engineers assigned to Cradle 7's repair rotation. Of those, 37 held master-grade certification, which is the highest civilian engineering credential the fleet recognizes. 12 of those 37 were what we call deep specials, engineers whose certification includes the specific sub-discipline of launch rail, shear systems, coupling arrays, and thrust feed alignment. They are the people you call when a launch rail fails. They are, in the language of fleet logistics, the solution. Thara was the flagship of the Third Reach. She was a Sovereign-class capital ship, 2 kilometers from bow to stern, and she was locked in Cradle 7, with a seized pressure coupling on her primary launch rail that none of the 104 engineers, 12 deep specials included, had been able to free in 3 days. I will explain what a pressure coupling is, briefly, because the log should be comprehensible to someone who is not an engineer. Pressure coupling on a capital-class launch rail is the fitting that joins the ship's internal thrust feed manifold to the cradle's external launch rail assembly. When the ship is in the cradle, this coupling locks to keep the ship seated against the rail during pre-launch pressurization. When the ship is ready to launch, the coupling releases, the rail pressurizes, and the ship departs. It is, in principle, a simple mechanism. It is, in practice, the single most load-bearing connection in the launch sequence, which is why it is machined to tolerances that require a certified deep special engineer and calibrated fleet-grade instruments to service. The Kreen. Vethara. His coupling had been locked for 72 hours when Admiral Sen Vale sent word that she was coming aboard. Admiral Vale commanded the Third Reach. Vethara was her ship. She was not, in my experience, a patient officer, and she was not coming aboard to express satisfaction with our progress. She was coming because the Vethara was needed 2 systems away, and we were the reason she was still here. And that was not a situation any of us wished to be in. I remember standing on the Krill 7 observation gallery at the start of the 4th day, looking down at the launch rail. The rail ran the length of the cradle floor, a paired track of burnished alloy 400 meters long, and the Vethara sat above it like a held breath, enormous, still, expensive. Along the rail and around the coupling housing at the ship's aft ventral quarter, I could see the engineers. They were clustered in groups, some with instruments in hand, some consulting data slates, some simply standing with the posture of people who have been standing in the same place for a long time and have not yet found a reason to stand somewhere else. The coupling housing itself was a cylinder of gray alloy, roughly a meter in diameter, set into the rail assembly at an angle of 14 degrees from vertical, as the design specifies. Around it on the deck, the engineers had arrayed their equipment: torque calibration frames, pressure induction tools, thread mapping sensors, a thermal expansion cradle, harmonic resonance units that had been brought up from Cradle 2, and a powered torque driver with a force output rated to 800 kilonewton meters, which is, I am told, approximately what it would take to unscrew a small moon. The coupling had not moved. My chief of engineering, a Verith officer named Commodore II Rayeth, had given me 3 days of increasingly apologetic reports. The coupling was seized on the thread. The thread pitch was standard Verith Mark 7, reach current specification. The tools were correct. The process was correct. The coupling should, by every measurement they had taken, be free. It was not free. It was, in the assessment of Rayeth's best deep specials, seized by a combination of micro-weld, from thermal cycling and thermoform deformation, at the 4th and 5th engagement points, and the only way to free it without damaging the thread beyond repair was to apply the correct torque at the correct angle, with a tool that could reach the engagement points precisely. They had the tools. They had the angle. They did not have results. I stood on the gallery and watched them, and I thought about Admiral Vale's ship, and I thought about the meeting I was going to have with Admiral Vale in approximately 4 hours. I thought about what I was going to say in that meeting, and none of what I was thinking made me feel any better about my morning. It was while I was thinking these things that I noticed Riva Dan. She was on the apron, the broad maintenance floor that runs along the base of the forward blast wall, pushing her broom in long, methodical strokes. The apron is not technically the work area. The work area is the rail itself and the space around the coupling housing. The apron is where debris accumulates, where fluid catch trays sit. Floor staff do what floor staff do. She was not in the engineer's way. She was simply there, doing her job, in the same room as a crisis she was not part of and had no reason to be part of. I watched her for a moment, the way you watch something that is moving, in a room where everything else is still. The engineers were still. She was moving. There was something clarifying about it, though I could not have said what. Then I went back to my office to prepare for the Admiral's arrival, and I forgot about her. The Admiral arrived at the 14th hour of the 4th day. Admiral Sen Vale was 63 years old, a career fleet officer, and a person who communicated primarily through the precision and economy of her silences. She had silver rank filaments at both shoulders, the double rank of a full admiral, and she wore them the way some officers wear decorations, which is to say she wore them as if she had forgotten they were there, which is the best way to wear any authority. She walked through the station with her aide 2 steps behind, and her expression approximately 2 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature of deep space. I met her at the cradle access corridor. I gave her my report. I told her what the engineers had found, what they had tried, and what they had not been able to do. I told her all of this in the most precise and honest language I could manage, because Admiral Vale had a known and documented intolerance for imprecision and a known and documented intolerance for people who tried to dress up a failure as anything other than a failure. She listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she looked at the coupling housing for a long moment, and then she looked at the engineers, and then she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, "Walk me through it again." We walked. We stood at the coupling housing. Commodore II Rayeth explained the thread engagement, the micro-weld theory, the 17 different torque approaches they had attempted. He was thorough. He was honest. He was, I could see, genuinely baffled, which was unusual for Rayeth, who was not a man easily baffled. Admiral Vale looked at the housing. She looked at the force output numbers on the powered torque driver's interface. She looked at Rayeth. She said, "And you have tried every instrument at your disposal." Rayeth said, "Every instrument rated for this coupling type, Admiral." "Yes." A short silence. It was into this silence that Riva Dan spoke. She was not on the apron anymore. I do not know precisely when she had moved. At some point, without anyone marking it, she had come to stand at the edge of the work area, perhaps 5 meters from where we stood. Broom leaned against the coupling housing's safety rail, her utility apron around her waist, her hands. And I remember this detail specifically because I remember thinking it was an odd thing to see at that moment. Her hands were clean. Floor staff's hands are not usually clean at the end of a shift. She had wiped them on her rag. She said, "Excuse me." Everyone looked at her. She said, "Is that a Markson coupling?" Raeth looked at me. I looked at the Admiral. The Admiral looked at the woman in the gray coveralls, with the orange shoulder tab, and said nothing. I said, "It is," she said. "Reach current spec?" Said carefully. "Yes," she said. "When was the station commissioned?" Raeth said, "Orith Vel, 31 years ago." "Why?" she said. "The Vethara." There was a pause. I said, Vethara. Commissioned 34 years ago. She predates the station by 3 years. The woman, Riva Dan, though I still did not know her name, looked at the coupling housing for a moment. Then she said, 7 current thread pitch was standardized 29 years ago. Before that, Mark 7 couplings ran a slightly different pitch on the 4th and 5th engagement points. The Vethara was built 5 years before standardization. If her manifold thread was cut to the pre-standardization pitch and was never remachined, which it might not have been, if the tolerance drift was within the acceptance window and nobody caught it, then the current spec coupling is slightly mismatched at exactly the 4th and 5th engagement points. Nobody said anything, she said. That's why your torque isn't working. Trying to turn a pre-standard with standard torque geometry. The microel theory might be right. The deformation is probably from the mismatch working over years, not from thermal cycling. A torque driver isn't going to help you. You need a tapered drift punch and something heavy. Raeth looked at the coupling. He looked at his data slate. He looked at Raeth's second Orev, his senior deep special, who was standing 3 meters away with an expression I can only describe as a man trying very hard to remember something, should have thought of 3 days ago. Raeth's second Orev said quietly, "The meridian pitch variation." The woman said, "Yes." Raeth looked at her. He said, "How do you know about the meridian pitch variation?" she said. "I did 6 years at the Meridian Yards before I came here," sighed Civilian Dry Dock. "We repaired a lot of old pre-standardization hardware. You get to know the thread types," I said. "Do you have a drift punch?" she said. "I have one in my locker. Give me 5 minutes." The Admiral had not said a word during any of this. Her expression had not changed in any visible way, but she had turned, I noticed, very slightly, so that she was no longer looking at the coupling housing. She was looking at Riva Dan. Riva went to her locker. She came back in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know this because I watched the clock on the bay wall. For no reason I could have articulated, except that something told me to pay attention. She carried a tapered drift punch, which is a tool that looks like a blunt metal spike with a gradual taper along its length, roughly 30 centimeters long, and a short-handled mallet that was significantly older and more battered than anything else in Cradle 7. The mallet's head was a solid cylinder of dense alloy, 2 kilograms or thereabouts, with a handle wrapped in black friction tape that had been rewrapped many times. It had the look of a tool that had been used, and used, and used again, and had not once complained about it. She set the drift punch against the coupling housing at an angle I could not have specified, but she found without hesitation. At the 4th engagement point, where the thread mismatch would be worst. She looked at the angle for a moment, adjusted by perhaps 3 degrees, looked again, and then struck the punch with the mallet. Once. A clean, resonant sound, heavy and precise. Not the random clang of a blow badly placed, but the specific sound of force going exactly where it was directed. She moved the punch, reset at the 5th engagement point, looked at the angle, struck once more. Then she set the punch aside, put both hands on the coupling housing, turned it, a quarter turn, smooth and even, the way a lid comes off a jar when the seal has finally yielded. Not a fight, just a release. The coupling came free. In the hangar, no one spoke. Riva stepped back. She picked up her mallet. She looked at the freed coupling, and then she looked around at the engineers. And her expression was the expression of someone who has just done a thing they have done many times before and does not understand why everyone is staring. She said, "You'll want to check the thread pitch on the replacement before you install. If the manifold thread is pre-standard, you'll need a pre-standard coupling, or you'll be back here in 3 years with the same problem." Second Orev said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Yes, of course, she said. And if you want, I can write down what I know about the meridian pitch variations. There were 4 different subspecs before standardization. The Proops. Vithura. Ran the Type C, based on her build year, but you should check. Raeth looked at me. I looked at the Admiral. Admiral Vale walked forward. She crossed the 12 meters of deck between where she had been standing and where Riva Dan was standing, and she stopped in front of her, and she looked at her for a moment in silence. Riva looked back. She did not fidget. She held her mallet at her side. The Admiral said, "What is your name?" she said. "Riva Dan, Admiral. Floor staff, Cradle 7, the Admiral said. "Where did you train, Riva Dan of Cradle 7? She said. "The Meridian Yards, Earth, 6 years as a coupling and manifold technician. After that I moved around a bit. I've been here 6 years. The Admiral said. "Why are you floor staff?" A pause. Riva said, "My certification lapsed when I left Meridian. I didn't renew. Things were complicated for a while." A short silence. "The floor work is steady," the Admiral said. "Your certification lapsed," Riva said. "Yes, Admiral." The Admiral turned to me and said, "Commodore Tarrell, what does this station certification pathway require for conversion from floor staff to technical rating?" I said. "A current certification in the relevant discipline, a demonstrated practical examination administered by the station's chief of engineering." The Admiral looked at Raeth. Raeth was already nodding. The slow, comprehensive nod of a man whose objections have been preemptively removed by events. The Admiral said, "Schedule the examination. Whatever she needs to sit it, provide it." She looked at Riva again. "If you pass, and I have a strong suspicion you will pass, you will be reinstated as a technical officer at whatever grade you're demonstrated. Competence warrants. Commodore Raeth will determine that grade," Riva said. "Admiral, I appreciate that, but I," the Admiral said, "freed my ship." A silence. Riva said, "I hit a bolt with a mallet." The Admiral said, "You knew which bolt to hit and where and how hard, and you knew it in the time. It took every master engineer on this station to tell me they could not do it. That is not hitting a bolt with a mallet. That is 37 years of knowledge. You're 6 at Meridian, they're 31 in the wrong direction." She paused. "The examination is not optional." Riva looked at her mallet for a moment. She looked at the coupling, now free, sitting loose in its housing. She looked up at the Admiral with an expression that was not gratitude exactly. It was more complicated than that. The expressions of someone who has been offered a thing they had stopped expecting and is not yet sure what to do with it, she said. "All right, Admiral, I'll sit the examination," the Admiral said. "Good," she turned to me. "Commodore Tarrell, I want this entered in the station log. Her name, work, and the specific nature of the problem she identified, not in the incident file. In the technical record, under coupling systems," I said. "Yes, Admiral," she said. "And I want the notation to read that the solution was identified and executed by Riva Dan, civilian floor staff, Cradle 7, on the basis of training received at the Meridian Yards, Earth, dating Verith standardization, and that no Verith-trained engineer on this station identified it first." Raeth made a small sound. The Admiral looked at him. She said, "That is not a criticism, Raeth. It is a fact. The record should contain facts. If we leave out the facts that are inconvenient, we learn nothing. And in 30 years, some other engineer will stand in front of some other standardization thread and tell some other Admiral he cannot do it," Raeth said. "Yes, Admiral." The Admiral looked at the Vethera, at her own ship, enormous and still, and something moved through her expression that I could not read. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, or something older than either of those things. She said, "Get my ship out of the cradle." Then she walked out. The engineers worked through the rest of the day to install the correct coupling. A pre-standardization Type C, Riva identified from memory, and which Raeth's team verified against the Vithara's original build specifications, buried in an archive that had not been accessed in 14 years. The coupling seated cleanly. The thread engagement was confirmed. The launch rail pressurized to operational specification on the first test. The Vithara departed Cradle 7 at the 3rd hour of the following day. I watched her go from the observation gallery. She moved the way capital ships move when everything is working as it should, with a certainty of motion that is not speed exactly but something, more like inevitability, the sense of a large thing doing what it was made to do. I went down to the cradle floor afterward, while the bay was still being cleared for the next rotation. The coupling housing sat on a workbench, replaced now by the correct fitting, and the old one had been set aside to go to the machine shop for thread assessment. Next to it, someone had set the drift punch and the tapered mallet in a neat row, though they were not the station's equipment and did not belong there. I looked at them for a moment. Then I picked up the mallet. It was heavier than it looked, the grip smooth from years of use, the head without a mark on it that was accidental. Every mark on it was from work, from contact, from the specific and purposeful application of force to a place that needed it. I set it back down carefully, which is, I think, appropriate way to handle someone else's tool. Riva Dan sat her practical examination 11 days later. Commodore 2nd Raeth administered it personally, which is not required but which is his right as Chief of Engineering, and which told me something about where Raeth had landed after 4 days of failure followed by 11 minutes of someone else's competence. She passed. She passed what Raeth told me afterward was the highest scoring practical in the history of this station's technical conversion process, which is a record I expect will stand for some time. Because the examination was designed for people transitioning from adjacent technical fields and not for someone who had spent 6 years mastering pre-standardizations coupling systems at one of the oldest civilian dry docks in human space. Offered her a grade 7 technical posting. She asked if she could think about it overnight. In the morning she came back and asked if she could take a Redvive instead, with assignment to Cradle 7. Raeth said, "A grade 7 pays more," she said. "I know. But I know Cradle 7. I know where things are. I know which of the seal indicators runs cold on the north wall, and which of fluid catch trays has a slow leak in the number 3 channel. It would take me a year to learn another cradle the way I know this one, and while I was learning it, things would go wrong that I wouldn't catch." Raeth, to his considerable credit, said, "Grade 5 it is." Told she kept the orange shoulder tab. The technical rating tab is blue. She declined the blue one, or rather, she did not decline it. She simply continued to wear the orange one. And when someone mentioned it, she said she'd been wearing it for 6 years and it had broken in nicely. I am told that after approximately 2 weeks, nobody mentioned it anymore. She still has her broom. She told someone, I believe it was Raeth 2nd Orev, that she finds the sweeping useful for thinking, and that a clean apron is a safe apron, and that a safe apron means the rail doesn't accumulate debris that can work into the coupling housings over time, and that if she's going to be responsible for the health of the coupling systems in Cradle 7, she would rather start at the floor and work up than the other way around. I find I have no good argument against this. The notation the Admiral requested is in the station technical record. It reads as she specified: the date, the problem, the solution, the name of the person who found it, and the fact that no Vareth-trained engineer identified it first. I added one additional line, which was not the Admiral's instruction, but which I believe is within my authority as commanding officer. The solution was known. It was present in this bay for 6 years, in the form of a person. We did not think to ask. I don't know if anyone will ever read that line. Records like this are read when things go wrong, or when someone is assembling a case for a decision, when a historian has the patience to go through 30 years of technical filings and see what the day-to-day actually looked like. I hope they read it. I hope, if they do, they also go and find whoever is sweeping the apron and ask them what they know. I have been a Commodore for 11 years. I have learned in that time to read the shapes of problems before I know their names, to recognize the particular stillness of a situation, that will not resolve through official means, the way a bad weld looks before you test it. I thought I was competent at this. I thought I had calibrated myself to see the resources I had and use them well. I did not see Riva Dan for 6 years. That is in the record too now, not in so many words. The Admiral was right that the record should contain facts, and the fact is that the station's solution to a 34-year-old engineering problem was carrying a broom in the same room as the problem for 6 years, waiting for someone to ask. She is at last report, well, she has, in the 10 months since her re-rating, identified 2 additional pre-standardization anomalies in Cradle 7's coupling array, both minor, both documented, both corrected, before they became the kind of problem that locks a flagship for 4 days. Rayeth has started citing her findings in his technical briefs, which he attributes to her by name, which I believe is the correct practice, and which I believe Rayeth adopted more quickly than I would have, which speaks well of him. Admiral Vale sent a brief communique 3 weeks after the Vethera departure. It contained no personal address and no pleasantries. It contained one line. Confirmed Dan is on technical rating and log accordingly. Confirmed. She did not reply. That is, in my experience, Admiral Vale's version of well done. Keep this log. Because the fleet requires it, and because I believe that a true account of what happens aboard a station is worth more than the official account of what was supposed to happen. The two are not always the same. The gap between them is where things go wrong, and also, less often but more importantly, where things go right in ways nobody planned. Happened in Cradle 7 on the 4th day of the Vethara. Seizure was not planned. Nobody requisitioned a human dockhand with a mallet and 30 years of knowledge about a thread pitch that was obsolete. Treat before I had my first commission. Nobody put her in the rotation. She was there because she swept the apron. Yet she had the knowledge because she had spent 6 years at a yard that nobody in the Verith fleet would have thought to consult. She solved the problem because she had been in the same room with it long enough to understand it, which is a method the fleet does not teach and does not value and probably should. 11 minutes, 3 strikes, a quarter turn. I have watched capital ships depart this station for 31 years. I have watched decisions made and unmade. I have watched engineers work and fail and work again. I have watched the fleet deploy its instruments and its expertise and its considerable confidence in the correctness of its own methods, and I have watched those methods produce, on balance, results. Good enough that I became a Commodore and the station continues to function. But I also watched a woman carry a broom across 400 meters of hangar floor for 6 years, and I watched 12 of the fleet's finest deep specials spend 72 hours failing to do what she did in 11 minutes. And I watched the Admiral write her name into the record, and I watched Riva Dan go back to her apron the next morning and sweep it clean. If I have a conclusion to offer, and I am aware that a log entry is not the place for conclusions, I am 61 years old, and I am the commanding officer of this station, and I will make exceptions for myself when the record warrants it. Is this: the fleet knows what it is certified. It does not always know what it has. Riva Dan knew what she knew. She waited 6 years for someone to ask. The next time someone is sweeping my apron, I intend to ask sooner. Entry closed. Commodore Chev Taral. Station, Orithvel.